Hello. My name is Jamie McCracken. I'm our marketing coordinator here at Balance. Thank you all for taking the time to log on today and learn more about weight set point theory. Just by tuning in, you're putting energy towards learning about yourself and getting support for you or someone you may know, getting them what they need. So you're welcome here, and we're so happy to have you with us. Thanks for taking the time. We'll have Quinn share a presentation with you in a moment. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A panel. If you forget that the Q&A panel is there and you put them in the chat, that's just fine. We'll be answering questions all along the way. We'll pause for questions. And then anything that we don't get to, we have time set aside at the end for questions as well. So please feel free to share any thoughts that you have in the chat. Keep sharing where you're from. Keep sharing why you're here. Any reactions to Quinn. So if anything stands out to you, if anything reminds you of a memory in your struggle or a hope that you have for your recovery, anything at all is welcome in the chat. We appreciate you being loud. We love hearing from you. And we'd love for this to be an opportunity to connect with you as well as inform. So I'll pass it over to Quinn to introduce herself. Hey, Quinn.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks so much. So hello, everyone. I'm excited for everybody to attend this webinar today. I'm really excited to be presenting on this topic. My name is Quinn Haisley. I am one of the dietitians that works at Balance Eating Disorder Treatment Center. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm very excited to talk about this topic because I think that it's a really relevant and important topic, not only for clinicians to learn about, but also for people in recovery to learn about. And sounds like we might even have some loved ones of people in recovery as well. So really a topic that can be useful for everybody. I do want to preface this a little bit just because during parts of my presentation, I am going to be talking about how this topic in general relates to certain marginalized communities, that I am a cisgender white woman who does not have the lived experience of being in a larger body. And I think it's important to note that privilege before we start with this presentation. So if there's no other questions or anything, Jamie, should we get started?
Yeah, we can get going.
Get going. So very quickly, first to just go over what the objectives are of this presentation. We're first going to be describing what weight set point theory is. So really basic sort of definition of what it is. I do want to be doing a lot of kind of layman's terms in this presentation so that it's easy to understand for everybody. We're going to be detailing some of the issues with current weight paradigms that you'll see a lot of times that come up in different medical spheres, such as BMI and IBW, which stands for ideal body weight. So we'll be talking about both of those and some of the issues that come along with both of those. We're going to be talking more, this is more so for the clinicians who are joining us today, on how to estimate where somebody's set point weight might fall in order to help them to get close to reaching that set point weight while they're in recovery. And then the last thing that we're going to be talking about is both how clinicians and those in recovery can work on helping somebody to accept or feel neutrally about being at their set point weight, or another term that we sometimes use is also biologically appropriate weight. I do also want to note before we get started in this that just because I wanted this webinar and presentation to be accessible also for those in recovery, that I have not included a ton of specific numbers such as calorie numbers or weight numbers in this presentation. The main objective behind that is just not to have this webinar feel triggering to anybody or not to start any sort of comparison that can go on when it comes to bringing in specific numbers. So you might notice with things like some of the research studies that we talk about that I don't go into specifics with numbers, and I just wanted to explain why it is that I chose to do that. So let's start out with the most basic thing, which is just explaining what exactly is weight set point theory. So this is the theory that we have some internal mechanisms within our body that help to maintain a relatively narrow weight range with our body. And this is supposed to be the weight range that our body really naturally wants to settle at in order for it to function properly. So when we think about this, why is this important for eating disorder recovery? Well, we have found through research and really just through looking at people as they go through recovery, that if somebody can get to their set point range and also work on accepting being at that set point range, that they have an increased chance of maintaining that recovery and not relapsing. I think it's also really helpful, especially for clinicians, to know about set point range so that we can talk about how we can best help the clients that we are currently working with to reach a weight that is biologically appropriate for their body. So really important for eating disorder recovery. I also think just for anybody, even if they're not in recovery or not a clinician who works in the eating disorder field, that this is a good topic to know about because we don't get taught a lot of things about weight when it comes to set point theory. When we're talking about why this is currently a theory, science in general, theories are things that we have while we're still gaining research on the topic. So we are still definitely doing research behind what exactly set point weight is, all of the mechanisms that are in our body that might lead to a set point weight within our body. I also do kind of want to point out the fact that when it comes to research funding, we all know that the diet and weight loss industry has a lot of money behind it. And things like health at every size and set point weight, while I do think that those are becoming increasingly more popular to get research on, not always going to have as much funding just because of where the money falls. So definitely I want to point that out when it comes to the research behind this, but we will talk about some of the research, especially two of the studies that seem to come up the most often when we talk about set point theory. So when we're talking about set point theory, one of the main questions is how exactly does the body regulate our set point? So the body will adjust some of the internal systems that we have. The main part of our brain that's going to regulate this is the hypothalamus. And these systems are going to help to alter our food intake and also our energy expenditure in order to help us maintain that weight within that narrow set point range. A lot of times the body is doing this by gauging any kind of changes in our body with both fat mass and also fat-free mass, so like lean muscle mass versus fat mass. If you think of this, I like to think of this the most as like a thermostat for our body. So if we think about a thermostat, like a thermostat in my apartment right now, that if I'm adjusting it and I'm like, I want the temperature in my apartment to be 70 degrees, that if it goes above 70 degrees, my apartment would be like, okay, it's above 70 degrees. We're going to adjust it. We're going to turn air conditioning on so that the temperature is going to maintain at 70. If it's gone below 70, flip on the heat so that it goes back up to 70. So very similar mechanism happening within the body when it comes to our weight. So if the body notices a dip below that set point, it's going to say, okay, we need to now adjust food intake and energy expenditure to help increase the weight again. Similarly, if it's going much above the set point weight, body is going to do same kind of thing. So sending those signals to the brain, sending different signals to hormones in our bodies. We'll talk a little bit more about the science behind this in some of the research studies. But again, adjusting it when the body notices that there's any kind of shifts that are going on with that. So the main results that you're going to see with this are going to be changes in both appetite and hunger levels, and then also changes in our energy expenditure. So the term that I'm going to be using throughout this presentation is resting metabolic rate. And what resting metabolic rate is, for anybody who does not know, is it's going to be the calories or the energy that our body expends in order to keep us just basic functioning. Like if I were lying totally still, doing absolutely nothing, it is the amount of energy that my body would be expending just to keep my heart beating, my lungs breathing, my brain functioning. So absolutely base level. You also might sometimes hear the term basal metabolic rate. So those are going to be pretty interchangeable, but that's what I'm talking about when I say resting metabolic rate. So the body can shift the resting metabolic rate to either increase it to burn more energy or decrease it to burn less energy, depending on what it's seeing happening within that body and with the set point. So I'm going to be talking about two studies. Well, I guess first, Jamie, do we have any kind of questions that are coming up in the chat?
Thanks for pausing. Not at the moment, but if anyone wants to sound off with something real quick, feel free while we're talking about this survey, and we'll get back to you maybe in a moment or maybe at the end.
Yes. I will continue on then, start talking about some of the research. So there's definitely some newer research that's been coming out as far as explaining some of the mechanisms of action or what exactly it is that's happening in the body when it comes to set point weight. But I think two of the studies that I see referenced the most often when it comes to showing that set point weight, first off, like even is a thing, and also proving the different mechanisms that are happening within the body when it comes to set point weight are the Minnesota starvation study, which is the first study I'm going to be talking about. And then the second study I'm going to be talking about is one that's called the Biggest Loser study. It was based off of the television show The Biggest Loser. I don't know if you remember that show. It's kind of horrifying, but we're going to be talking about that a little bit more in a bit. We're starting out with the Minnesota starvation study. So this study was conducted in 1944 by someone named Ansel Keys. And the study was actually not intended at all to be related to eating disorders or to figure out like changes in the body when it comes to set point weight. That was not the intention of the study. It was done around the time of World War II, and it was done to test the effects of refeeding, mostly for prisoners of war during the war. So had a totally different intention, but it is still one of the studies that we come across the most often that comes up when we talk about eating disorder recovery and set point weight theory. So the study was conducted with 36 young men, and how it works was they followed them for an initial 3 months. During those first 3 months, they just had them eat like their normal, typical diet. These men had pretty sound psychological health. They had no other health complications that were known of that were coming up for them. So they were supposed to be just kind of like standard baseline men in this study. And then for 6 months after that initial 3 months sort of observation period, they went through a period of semi-starvation. So for them, that meant eating approximately half the amount of calories that they had originally been eating. And then following this 6-month period of semi-starvation, they had another 3-month period of refeeding or rehabilitation. And they noted a bunch of things, both like physiological changes, but they also noted behavioral changes, mental changes that were happening with these men. And on average, the participants in this study lost about 25% of their body weight during that 6-month semi-starvation period. So you might be asking, okay, if this has nothing to do with eating disorder recovery or has nothing to do with set point weight, then why are we talking about this study? Because really we find that it is very applicable to both eating disorder recovery and set point theory, because it shows the effects on the body and also really mentally of semi-starvation. And we know that a lot of people who have an eating disorder can put their body into that set point of semi-starvation, really regardless of the type of eating disorder that somebody has. If there is any kind of restriction going on, that they can set themselves into that state of semi-starvation. So what they found with this study is that during the 6 months of restriction, so that semi-starvation period, there was an increased preoccupation with food. So looking up recipes, wanting to cook more. Some of them actually became chefs after this whole thing was done, wanting to eat things more than they previously had. There were definitely some reported binge eating, the men feeling like they had a loss of control over eating. They also noticed biologically that their resting metabolic rate, what we had been talking about before, was decreased by 40%, so almost half. And that resting metabolic rate actually did not increase or rebound during the first 3 weeks of the rehabilitation stage. So what we see here when we're talking about set point weight is that when they were in this period of semi-starvation where they were not meeting their body's energy needs and they were going through weight loss, their body was actually slowing down their metabolism so they would burn less energy, meaning that they would need less energy to try to maintain their weight. It's kind of that body's just protective mechanism of, oh, we don't want to be losing weight like this. We're going to slow down the metabolism to prevent that from happening. So we saw that decrease in the resting metabolic rate. And then during the 3-month rehabilitation or refeeding phase, a lot of the participants reported that they had increased hunger signals. So feeling like they were hungry all the time, like they couldn't be satiated, like they needed to eat a larger portion of food in order to meet their hunger needs and feel fullness. There was some continued loss of control over eating, some binge eating that happened even during that rehabilitation or refeeding phase as well. So not even just during that semi-starvation phase. So we're really seeing here that that body, again, has that protective mechanism of We want to make sure we're getting enough nutrition. We want to make sure that we're eating enough. So we're going to increase the hunger signals in our body. We're going to decrease the amount of energy that's being expended to try to really maintain that set point weight. So that's one of the reasons why you see this study come up the most often when we're talking about set point weight theory. The second study that we're going to be talking about is the Biggest Loser study. Now, for anybody who has not watched the show, The Biggest Loser, it is a weight loss show, and they go through pretty extreme measures to lose weight on this show. So there's heavy restriction of portions of foods, types of foods, lots of physical activity going on. And so because of this, they wanted to do a research study that followed 14 of the contestants from one of the seasons of The Biggest Loser. And what's lovely about this study is the fact that they followed them for 6 years after the initial start of the research study. A lot of times when we're talking about weight loss studies or studies on things like resting metabolic rate, things like that, we only get studies that last for like maybe a year. Like even a year is usually like, oh, that's a great research study. They followed them for a year. It's such a long time. But we do know that when it comes to weight loss, weight regain, things like that, that a lot of times we want to be looking more long-term. So that's why this study is great, because they showed that they were following them for 6 years after that initial start of the study. What they were looking at mainly with the contestants from The Biggest Loser was weight regain after the show had ended, as well as similarly to the Minnesota starvation study, what was happening with that resting metabolic rate, so the energy expenditure with these people. And the main finding from this study was we found that despite substantial weight regain in the 6 years following participation in The Biggest Loser, the resting metabolic rate remained suppressed at the same average level as at the end of the weight loss competition. So to explain a little bit more what was happening in this study, they found that they took the resting metabolic rate, how much energy they were expending at the beginning of the show, right after the show had ended, and then also 6 years down the line. And the body had done very similarly to what they had seen in the Minnesota starvation study. It had slowed down or decreased that resting metabolic rate to try to preserve the set point weight of the body. So it slowed down metabolism. And the main finding of the study, again, was the fact that that slowed or decreased resting metabolic rate did not actually rebound back to where it had previously been after 6 years, that it stayed decreased, it stayed suppressed. Obviously, with The Biggest Loser, this is a pretty extreme example of restriction, extreme weight loss. So this is, again, extreme example of what might be going on with somebody's body when it comes to either restriction or semi-starvation or weight loss. But it is a really good example of kind of showing what's happening in the body when it comes to that resting metabolic rate, and how that decreases, and how the body really is holding on as much as it can to the weight that it has as a sort of self-preservation mechanism. We think about our bodies cannot tell the difference between being in a period of famine and not having enough to eat, or us restricting the amount of food that we're eating. So either way, regardless of if it's us doing it to ourselves or if it's a period of famine, the body's going to put itself into that sort of, I'm going to save myself sort of state, and it's going to try its best to hold on to that weight because that's how it feels it's going to save itself the most. So again, kind of proving also with the weight regain that they saw with these contestants that the body really wants to hold on to a lot of this weight. It doesn't want to shift, and it's going to rebound back to where it had been at the start. Any questions coming in about these?
Sure. I know offline you shared that there maybe isn't as much statistical information directly around weight set, but someone did ask in the chat, and maybe I could spin it a bit. If there were any studies on what happens to people who yo-yo diet over a period of many, many years, maybe whether, if there isn't, why there isn't, and regardless, what are some of the results of yo-yo dieting?
Yes, that is such a good question. I will talk a little bit more about some of like the health effects of yo-yo dieting a little bit down the line in the presentation. But if we're talking about set point weight and what we tend to see with yo-yo dieting, or another term that I would use is weight cycling. So sort of the back and forth of losing weight, regaining that weight, losing weight, regaining that whole thing, is that you can actually see an increase in where somebody's set point weight starts to go. So kind of like to think of it as like a little step ladder. So somebody's set point weight is down here and they're like, I'm going to try to lose a little bit of weight. We're going to go on a diet, and they lose the weight. And then kind of like what we see with the Biggest Loser study, there's then weight regain. They might maintain that for a little bit, and then they go, I'm going to try to do the same thing again. I'm going to go on a diet, try to lose weight. They might decrease a little bit more. And then there's weight regain. And a lot of times what we see is more weight regain after that weight loss. So again, it's kind of like stepping up, stepping up, stepping up. So we typically see that somebody's weight that they end up at is higher after yo-yo dieting than it would have been had that person just never dieted in the first place, which is, again, why trying to discourage people from going on those diets or doing the yo-yo dieting or the weight cycling, because the body is better at maintaining that set point weight that it naturally wants to be at if the dieting is never happening in the first place. That's a really good question. Also, very common question that comes up. Totally. Any other questions?
Yeah, someone is wondering if or how people in the study boosted their suppressed RMR. Was it healthy for them to stay at the reduced RMR for a time or at all?
I would say that obviously I don't think it's the healthiest to have the body do that sort of like suppressed RMR. Again, I think that the Biggest Loser is like a really extreme example of what's happening in the body just because of how quickly the weight loss was happening, how much weight was being lost, and the like extreme measures that they were going through. We do find that people can, what I would just say is healing their metabolism after a period of time. But we did see with these contestants that while some of them did end up slightly increasing their RMR a little bit higher than what they had done like right after the show had ended, that for a lot of them it really did stay suppressed. But we don't see this with everybody. So it's not like everybody who has that decreased RMR because of restriction is going to maintain that decreased RMR. Some people do end up through the refeeding process, through getting back to a set point weight, can heal their metabolism enough to have their RMR return back to where it had been previously. Good question as well.
Thanks.
Any more questions?
Not for the moment, but please keep sounding off. These are really great questions.
Yes.
I'd love to hear your thoughts along the way. Someone just got just in the nick of time. How would someone find out their own resting metabolic rate?
Oh, that is a very good question. So really the most basic answer that I can give you is if you have a lot of money and you have access to something like a research hospital, you might be able to do that. We learn as clinicians, especially as a dietitian, we learn some equations. There's a number of equations that we can use in order to try to estimate what somebody's RMR is. But the most accurate way that we can do it, honestly, is to hook somebody up to this machine that measures how much oxygen they're sort of like taking in and then how much CO2 they're letting out. That's how we would estimate it most accurately, but most people don't have access to that amount of money or a research hospital. So most people will never know their exact RMR. For clinicians, we can estimate it as best as possible using some of the equations that we're usually taught in school. For somebody who's in recovery, I usually try to steer clear of finding out or estimating their own resting metabolic rate or their own calorie needs, just because I don't necessarily think that having those numbers attached to it is super useful. If we talk about things like calorie counting, that can become part of the eating disorder to like track that so much and be really rigid about that. So I don't usually encourage somebody who's in recovery to calculate their RMR because of that reason.
Cool. Thanks. Really, really great answer to that. That's what I asked. Real quick before, and then I'll let you go into the next slide. But someone is curious about the difference between these two studies, the Biggest Loser study and the Minnesota study, and particularly about just, I don't know, just what controls they used or what you found were different. I know you said already that the Biggest Loser study studied people who were going through a lot more of an extreme environment and change. Yeah. But any other differences in relation to kind of the difference in decreases in RMR?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would say again is that the start point was definitely different for the two populations in these studies. That first off, with the Biggest Loser, you have wider variety of gender. And you usually had people who were, because it's the Biggest Loser, they were people in larger bodies that were participating in the Biggest Loser study, which is different than the Minnesota starvation study. You also have the time span that this was taking place over. So for the Biggest Loser study, you have the fact that this is going on for 6 years afterwards, versus with the Minnesota starvation study, you had that like initial 3 months, the 6 months of the semi-starvation, and then the follow-up, which only lasted 3 months. So also different time lengths with this. I think that the main point with this is that you saw more of a like rapid rebound and healing of the metabolism with the participants from the Minnesota starvation study because of where they had started out, and because it was less of an extreme example than the Biggest Loser study, which had obviously different starting point and different populations for sure.
Awesome. Thanks. We got a couple more questions in, but I think they'd be more relevant for later. So go on ahead.
Amazing. So next thing that I want to talk about, so here at Balance, we do follow a health at every size philosophy, which I think is really important. And I also really think that what set point theory and health at every size, or HAES, go hand in hand. And that in order to help somebody to follow the HAES principles, that it's important to encourage somebody to kind of get to that point where it's set point weight and working on accepting set point weight. So for some background, the Health at Every Size movement was founded by Lindo Bacon. They have amazing books. If anybody's interested, I would definitely highly recommend. And it is a weight neutral approach that is focused on promoting healthy behaviors in people with various body sizes. I think this is very different than what we typically see medically when it comes to weight currently, that it is not weight neutral usually at all. So it's a different shift to think about things for health from a very weight neutral perspective. The basic components of HAES is the respect of diversity, critical awareness of scientific and cultural assumptions, and compassionate self-care, both for the person themselves, but also for other people. So as a medical practitioner or a clinician, having compassionate self-care also for the people that we are taking care of. What's really interesting and something that I am like very excited for when it comes to HAES research, again, I feel like HAES research, because HAES in general is a little bit newer and sometimes there's again less funding for things like HAES research, that we don't have as much of it as I would like to see. But there have been more studies coming out recently, and a lot of these show really promising effects of HAES as improving the health markers of chronic conditions like cardiovascular disease, diabetes. A lot of times when we're talking about weight, especially in the United States, for those of you who are training from elsewhere, I know this is a really big conversation in America, that a lot of these chronic health conditions like cardiovascular disease, like diabetes, are tied to weight, where people are saying, okay, if somebody has a higher weight body, they put themselves at risk of these chronic health conditions. With the Health at Every Size research that we're seeing, it's showing that even with a weight neutral approach to health, so focusing on other markers of health, other ways that somebody can improve their health that is apart from their weight, we can still help somebody with these markers for chronic health conditions in the same way. So I think this is really important, because not only are you then helping somebody with those physical aspects of their health, but also you're helping them mentally, because a lot of the other ways of looking at weight and health where it is not weight neutral can have some very damaging effects mentally on somebody. So to be able to have an approach that is both helping the quantity of life that somebody is having, but also helping their quality of life, both mentally and physically, I think is beautiful to see. Shifting to a HAES approach can also help with reducing anti-fat bias. There is a lot of anti-fat bias in society. There's a lot of anti-fat bias in the medical community. We know that this can result in people not wanting to go to the doctor's office, not getting the actual diagnosis that they should be getting because people are telling them it's just due to their weight and then telling them to lose weight and then dismissing anything else. With eating disorders, it's doctors or other clinicians missing the fact that somebody has an eating disorder because they might be at a higher weight body or in a BMI category that's in the normal range. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's why I'm excited that HAES has been catching on a little bit more. And again, at Balance, we definitely have a very strong HAES approach where we're looking more at how we can help somebody with their health that is not solely tied to their weight. So let's talk about some of these, what I consider more problematic things when it comes to weight. First one is BMI. So BMI, for anybody who does not know, is an equation that's going to compare the weight of a person to their height. And then the resulting number that you get from this equation is used to categorize a person into 4 different categories. That is underweight, normal, overweight, or obese. I tend to not like to use these terms when I'm talking to clients, just in general. I think moving away from terms like normal or obese is really helpful for the clients that we're serving. The main thing to note about BMI is that it was created by a mathematician and an astronomer, and I might butcher his name because I don't know how to pronounce it necessarily, but Adolf Quetelet, I want to say. It was invented between 1830 and 1850. And this was originally designed for statistical purposes to be used on populations, and it was to help identify the average man or the societal or social ideal of that time period. He only used French and Scottish participants, so very narrow range population we're talking about here, very white population, mostly male population. And BMI, this is the main thing to emphasize, was not created as a way to evaluate the individual health of a person. But when we think about how BMI is largely used currently in the medical field, that's usually how it's used. It's used to determine whether somebody is at a healthy weight by looking at their BMI category. That was never what the intended purpose was. So I think the fact that we're using it in a way that it was never intended to be used, and the fact that we're applying this equation, which was used for white men at this time period, and we're applying it to all populations, is not useful. And have that as like a weight parameter for everybody is really very generalized, and it's not always going to be useful or applicable to everybody that we're interacting with. The next one that I want to talk about, and this is not used as often, you might not see it's used as often as you would BMI, but we definitely use it, especially in the eating disorder field, is IBW, which is also known as ideal body weight. And this was initially created by somebody named Ben J. Devine in 1974. And it was used for anesthesiologists to help with the estimation of drug clearance in obese patients. Very similarly to BMI, the number was not initially intended to evaluate the health of an individual or the weight that a person's body should actually be at, but that is a lot of times how it is used currently. I know also the eating disorder field, as a dietitian, insurance companies or different facilities like eating disorder organizations sometimes want to know what a person's IBW or the percent of their IBW that they are in order to be covered by insurance. Again, try at Balance, we use this in order to help with insurance purposes, but a lot of times we put more emphasis on somebody's biologically appropriate weight, or again, set weight, the range that they should be at, rather than their IBW, because I don't think that's actually a useful marker of the weight that somebody should be at. Similarly to BMI, there is an equation that we can use to determine what somebody's IBW, but we don't consider their race, weight history, weight cycling, what their eating behaviors look like, what their environment looks like, whether in the process of transitioning, anything like that. So again, I think that it is not a useful thing to apply to all populations. Any other questions coming in, Jamie?
I think some of this we can save for the end, but as we're nearing the end, I just wanted to offer to everyone, there is a lot of science here. So if anyone is kind of slipping on an acronym or anything, we're all in the community, if not in this field. So I'm sure everyone's pretty knowledgeable already, but feel free to ask those questions as well. Any simple is great too.
Yes. Let's move on. So I know there had been a question that came up about estimating set point weight, or like how can somebody tell like what's the metabolic rate, that kind of stuff. Again, for people who are in recovery, I do think that some people who are in recovery, I have certain clients who know what their set point range will end up being at, that we've had that conversation, we've been able to process through that, and they're able to know that information and still move on in their recovery. And I have other clients where I do not think it is useful for them to know what their set point range is. I think that it is going to be more damaging for their recovery than supportive of their recovery. So I don't think it's necessary, first off, or always useful for somebody to know what their set point range is going to be at. Main thing for any clinician when trying to gauge what a set point rate is going to be is considering the individual. Just think about that person, get as many details, as much history as you can. So first thing that I want to figure out is, when did the person's eating disorder behaviors start? If somebody's behaviors started in their childhood, that's going to definitely change what's happening with set point weight versus if somebody's eating disorder behaviors started maybe in their mid-20s. So first, considering when did the behavior start. If you have access to growth charts, especially for pediatric clients, that's amazing. Get growth charts, because we always are trying to get somebody, if they've fallen off of their growth chart, to go back to where they had been tracking along their growth chart. So when possible, always try to get as much information like growth charts as you can, be in contact with doctors, gather as much information from that person, or again, from any other medical professionals they might have been working with about their weight history and their eating behaviors, so that you can sort of start creating a timeline for yourself of like, okay, this is going on with their eating behavior. Was it restricting? Was it binging? What was happening? And what was the weight like at that point, to try to gauge what was happening? Again, set point is meant to be a range, and it's going to change over somebody's lifespan. So it's not like me giving somebody a number and being like, and it's that number, and it's that number only, and it's that number forever. No, it's going to be some kind of a range. And as that person ages, it also can shift. Also consider the genetics of the individual. Do you know what kind of weight ranges their family members are in? Considering their stress levels that they might be at. What is their eating environment like? Do they have access to food? So always during any kind of initial sessions with somebody, just really try to gather as much information as possible as I can in order to best estimate what somebody's set point weight might be at. For clinicians, I know we already kind of talked about this question a little bit, but what should clinicians know? For yo-yo dieting, we did talk about what can happen with somebody's set point weight when they have been yo-yo dieting. But in addition to that, we also see a lot of health consequences of yo-yo dieting or weight cycling, such as reduced muscle mass, hormonal imbalances, increased risk of developing eating disorder behaviors if they did not have those originally, an increased risk of chronic health conditions such as cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. It's really important to assess whether again, like I said previously, whether the individual would benefit from knowing their set point range. So some people can know their set point range while they're in recovery, feel comfortable with that, and not have that cause like undue distress for them. But for other people, it might not be actually supportive of their recovery to know what set point range they're aiming for. Helping someone to maintain their set point range can also decrease their risk of relapse with their eating disorders. So that's also why it's really important to reach that set point range and maintain a weight around that range to help prevent relapse. For transgender individuals, remembering that body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria are going to be two separate things. So when we're talking about helping somebody to accept their set point, whereas the treatment for body dysmorphia, you would never encourage something like surgery in order to help with something like that. For something like gender dysphoria, it's going to be a little bit different. Some people do end up going through surgeries or hormonal treatment in order to help with their gender dysphoria. So knowing that those are going to be two different things for anybody who's transitioning or is transgender. And individuals may have different reactions to their set point based on cultural background. So depending on what culture they're coming from, it might be either easier or harder to accept what set point weight their body is naturally going to fall at. So understanding your client's cultural background and how that could impact them. For those who are in recovery or for loved ones of those in recovery, again, very similar, going to keep reiterating, consider knowing whether the set point range is actually beneficial for you or not. And for those kind of figuring out, okay, how do I even know if I'm at my set point range? Like what things should I be looking out for to know whether I'm at my set point range? It's going to include things like eating according to hunger and fullness. That also means being able to be in touch with the sensations of hunger and fullness. The weight should be relatively stable without the use of behaviors like restricting, binging, using any other compensatory strategies. Eating should not be causing increased distress or anxiety. So really finding that there is a neutral approach to food and eating. engaging in joyful movement as long as that's appropriate in recovery. So working with clinician, whether that's doctor, dietitian, somebody to gauge whether or not physical activity is appropriate, and if so, what kind of physical activity is appropriate. And then using the concept of gentle nutrition. For anybody who knows intuitive eating, this is one of the parts of intuitive eating. So this means that you're, yes, considering things like the nutritional density of food, meaning like how many vitamins and minerals are in that food, and am I getting different parts of my macronutrients from the foods that I'm eating, but also considering the satisfaction factor of food. So am I letting myself having the foods that I'm craving? Am I eating to satisfaction? Do I find that I'm actually liking the things that I'm eating? So not only considering the nutrition of food, but also how much you're actually enjoying the things that you're eating. And then this is probably one of the biggest but most difficult parts, which is why I didn't solely focus on this during this presentation, but I know that we've had previous webinars on body image, and we definitely have some other resources I'm sure we can talk about at the end with body image. But when working towards accepting a set point weight, emphasizing for sure that we do not live in a weight neutral society. I think acknowledging that for some of my clients is really useful to say, like, yes, this is not only about the fact that you have to personally work towards accepting your set point weight, but you are doing so not in a vacuum, but in a society that is not weight neutral, because that can make it more difficult for somebody to get to a point where they're actually accepting their set point weight. So as feasible, I encourage individuals who are in recovery to have a team, whether that's dietitian, doctor, therapist, psychiatrist, have as many people on the team be on the same page with things like health at every size and set point weight, so that there isn't mixed messaging going on about weight when it comes to recovery. Knowing that the process takes time. On average, when it comes to body image, takes like about 18 months for somebody to get to a point with body image where they really start feeling more neutral and more accepting with their body. It is not a short-term process. It is a long-term process. Moving towards body neutrality and acceptance can include moving through the stages of grief. I have some handouts that I like to send clients sometimes about the different stages of grief where, you know, they might be bargaining with their eating disorder at some point, feeling angry at themselves or their eating disorder or diet culture in general. So knowing that somebody might move through those stages of grief when it comes to letting go of maybe their old body, their eating disorder, and moving towards accepting their set point. Using practical tools as needed or as necessary, like covering up a mirror. If it is too much to look in the mirror, cover the mirror. Wearing comfortable clothing so that somebody isn't either like body checking with the clothing that they're wearing or becoming too attuned with how their clothing is fitting them, and changing up social media for sure. For anybody who's on social media, so much diet culture on social media today that trying to steer away from people or accounts that are going to make it more difficult to accept set point. And then practicing separating ourselves and our self-worth from our body size. So knowing the value that we have, the things that we know, who we are as a human being, apart from our body size and our weight. Questions? What questions do we have?
Cool. Thanks so much for sharing. There's a lot of information. I'm glad we got to the end there. Thanks so much, Quinn, for preparing that. Really cool. Lots of great information. And specifically really glad that we got this spin of both clients and clinicians. There are a few questions coming up in the chat kind of in that vein. Just wanted to start and give people with client questions some room, since that was the last thing we went over. And I wanted to start with someone who was asking, they made a joke about what someone might say to someone, a doctor who uses BMI in the office, but which I thought was hilarious. But it made me think seriously, what are things that people can say to their doctors when they feel either frustrated or when they're legitimately kind of being diminished by a doctor's opinion of their weight due to BMI being so prevalently used, or just people not understanding things like weight set point theory?
Yes, that is an amazing question, and something I know as a clinician I butt up against constantly. First, I think, again, like kind of what I said originally, if possible, and I know that It might be a limited pool to choose from sometimes, but trying to find doctors who are more weight neutral is a great place to start, because then you're usually going to get a lot less of that kind of information coming at you. The other thing is there are some tools out there. There are cards that I have some of my clients bring to the doctor's office that are called "Don't Weigh Me" cards. They literally just say, like, don't show me my weight, don't talk to me about my weight, it is not appropriate. And then on the back, it gives you these other reasons why it's not appropriate. I have called clinicians before to tell them, please do not discuss these things with my clients. It's not appropriate with them being in recovery. I've written letters for them to bring to doctors' offices. So I think as much as we can as clinicians, helping our clients to advocate for themselves in those spaces, because sometimes it really isn't comfortable for them to have that conversation with their doctor. Like, I don't want to talk about my BMI. I don't want you to talk to me about my weight, or like, these are the things that, I mean, there's some doctors who might refuse certain types of care to clients because of their BMI. So again, finding doctors when possible who are more weight neutral, and also then helping our clients by either role playing and conversations to help them understand how to talk to a doctor, or setting them up by calling a physician, sending them with a letter, giving them a card to bring. So if they don't feel comfortable talking to the doctor themselves, that you can help with that.
Cool. Thanks. And then also in that same vein, someone was asking, like, any tips for the process of finding a dietitian that uses this approach, or finding a team that uses this approach and still can take someone's insurance or work with them financially?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can be a very tricky thing to navigate, both finding somebody who is more Hays aligned or weight neutral in their approach, and also finding somebody, especially when it comes to insurance. Insurance can be incredibly frustrating to deal with. So I know for me, the best resource is honestly Google. Google is a great resource. Try and Google like health at every size dietitian or health at every size therapist. You will find some of those resources on there. Another thing that I think is really useful is if you already have some people on your team. I know I have a lot of listservs that I'm a part of. There's some Facebook groups that I'm a part of where I can go on there and be like, I have a client who like has these things going on with them right now. This is their insurance. Does anybody know anybody in the area, whether that's the area that I'm in or an area maybe in a different part of a country or different country entirely, who would be able to help them? So using those resources also, if you're currently working with anybody, of listservs, Facebook groups, social media groups, other people within the field that you can contact to try to get some more information about that. There's also just some websites in general that list Hays clinicians. And that's a great place to start too, although that doesn't always help so much with the insurance. It's mostly just like finding clinicians who are more Hays aligned.
Thanks, Quinn. Yeah, I'll also second that. I work a lot with admissions here and have gotten a view into that process. Definitely people who you aren't working with or are unable to work with can also be a resource for you. Definitely if you end up in an intake with us and say you're in a level of care that we can't treat at the moment, or it's just not the right fit, we do have plenty of resources and a huge network to share with you. And that goes the same for any health center clinician that you're in touch with. Even if they don't take your insurance, a lot of times they will be able to recommend somewhere that can. And those threads are hard to follow and can take some time, but definitely worth it. In that same vein, we have a lot of people kind of maybe sounding off about the length of a recovery journey. There's someone in the Q&A who is asking basically about the refeeding process kind of after coming back from like a severe eating disorder, and this sort of process of your body adjusting over time and creating a hypermetabolic state or a hypometabolic state, and kind of, swinging you back to normal. But if your new normal has gone so much lower, how do you stick with that process? How do you keep gaining weight even when you've gained enough weight, and maybe your clinician is kind of being like, you're only at this percentage of BMI, or you're only at this percentage of where you should be at. How does one kind of keep going and maybe use weights at point theory to kind of loosen up and keep an eye on the overall prize of health?
Yeah, that is such a difficult question. I think a very common one of like, how do I kind of, with how long of the process it can feel like it is, help myself to get through that, I think first off, just validating how difficult of a process it is and how uncomfortable the refeeding process can be. It's not comfortable. It's not a comfortable process. So I think working with clinicians as much as possible to help that feel as comfortable as possible. Again, it's not going to be one of those things where it's like refeeding is fine and it never feels uncomfortable, because it's definitely going to feel both physically and mentally uncomfortable. A lot of times what we do see, at least when it comes to anxiety during that initial refeeding process from an eating disorder, is that you'll see sort of this increase and spike in anxiety as that refeeding process is starting out. And then after a certain point, that anxiety does start to decrease. So I think always encouraging my clients to know that, yeah, that anxiety might be spiking right now and it might feel like it's just increasing and getting worse. But that is because we are moving in the right direction. We are moving towards a place where that anxiety does start to decrease. Physically as well. That initial physical part of refeeding can be extremely uncomfortable. As a dietitian, I think finding tactics for my clients such as, do we need to like decrease fiber intake for a little bit during that initial refeeding process so you don't feel as full during your meals? Or like, what other things can we do to help you make sure that we're limiting that discomfort that you're feeling physically as much as possible? And then what are some practical skills that we can use, therapeutic skills that we can use to help with the more difficult mental aspects of the refeeding process and that weight gain process? When it comes to set point, again, I think one of the things that is most useful to keep in mind is that sort of relapse rate when it comes to not reaching set point, that we find that it is a much higher relapse rate for somebody who has not reached and maintained their set point weight range. So knowing that that is more of a part of the long-term goal of recovery, that if I can get to my set point range, if I can help maintain that set point range, that my chances of maintaining my recovery from an eating disorder are going to be a lot higher. So having that kind of consistent reminder of why it is that set point range is even a goal to begin with. But then also, again, working with clinicians as much as possible to find both things to help mentally and physically with that initial refeeding process.
Cool. Thanks. Maybe in that same category of things that are, our body adjusting both ways, both up and down. A lot of people are asking in different ways, what does weight set point theory say about kind of the higher caloric side of disordered behavior? So binge eating or emotional eating. What does it say about when someone enters a hypermetabolic state, and what is the body doing at that point as compared to when our metabolism is too low from restricting?
Yeah, those are both good questions. I'm going to start with what happens sort of at set point if somebody is on the less restrictive side, so more binge eating or emotional eating, overeating side of an eating disorder. First thing I would say is sometimes that person isn't necessarily overshooting their caloric needs if they are binge eating or overeating at certain meals, because we do a lot of times with binge eating, emotional eating, overeating, find that somebody does still have some level of restriction, whether that's restricting earlier in the day and then binge eating at night, or restricting for a couple of days and then not restricting anymore. And so you will a lot of times still see some level of restriction that is going on with that. Somebody, when they had asked about the set point weight and how yo-yo dieting impacts it, what we do typically see sort of the same thing is that if somebody has kind of overshot where their set point range naturally would have fallen at, similarly, that it can normalize over a period of time. So somebody could, if it is appropriate for them in their recovery, lose some weight in recovery due to the fact that they are helping to stabilize and normalize their eating behaviors, and they are getting back down closer to where their set point range is at. So similarly to increasing weight, it can happen also with decreasing weight. For hypermetabolic things that can happen in the body, this definitely happens with some people, especially if there has been increased restriction with an eating disorder. You might find that somebody goes into a hypermetabolic state. Really what's happening during that period is the body is just trying to recover as much as it can, as quickly as it can. So it is trying to use all of the energy and things that it can to help refuel cells, rebuild different parts of the body, because the body has essentially at that point been depleting all of the cells of their energy. It might have been engaging muscle wasting, fat loss in order to help maintain energy for the body to function in general. So somebody can just shoot up their metabolism from skyrocket and go super hypometabolic when they're in that initial stage of refeeding, because it's just the body trying to refuel itself as quickly as possible. Usually we do find that somebody, if they are hypermetabolic, that'll come back down eventually. So again, just the metabolism spiking for a bit after that initial refeeding process in order to help the body get back on baseline. And then once it is, that metabolism can go back down again to where it would have been previously. So more of a normalized baseline resting metabolic rate.
Cool. Thanks so much. I'm gonna pause on questions for the moment. We have a few people saying they're logging out, and we were scheduled till 4, so I want to respect everyone's time. I'm gonna drop some resources in the chat, and then we'll go back to questions when you have a little bit of time, right?
Have like a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we'll try to get to a couple people. Really great thoughts, everyone. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us. And then Quinn, I always ask if people are open to be emailed directly with questions. If anyone has any, great. Yeah. I'll shoot you an email as well. Cool. So we really appreciate you all stopping by. Thank you so much. If you would like to speak with a member of our team, you can book a free consultation call with anyone on our admissions team at your convenience. The link to do that is here, balancetx.com/call. And you can get any of your questions answered about disordered eating or recovery, perhaps book an intake with us if you're at that point in your journey. I'm going to share the links to the studies that Quinn talked about here. And then someone asked about some things that we talked about verbally, but weren't on the slides. I'll follow up with Quinn later and see if we can get those out in our follow-up email to you all with the recording of this webinar. We have more webinars every single month, so you can check them out here. They'll be updated next week. And anytime you can look at all of our webinars. We have recordings of all of them on our YouTube channel. This one will be up at some point next week, and so you can take a look at it if you had to step out or if you had to leave early or if you'd just like to share it with someone. I know a couple of people asked if we could share the slides. Unfortunately, we can't. That's Quinn's property, but you're happy to watch it anytime. We're happy to have you watch it anytime. And then we also offer free support groups twice a month. So our free support groups are with our leadership, our CEO, Mulaney, or our clinical director, Sarah, or our director of admissions, Danielle. They're all great people, and you can talk to them face to face. It'll be more of a group setting instead of a webinar. And if you want to sign up for our next one, you can go here. And then finally, if you just want to call us directly, we are always on the line. We even have an answering service after hours. Our number is 212-645-6903. And we would just love to hear from y'all. Quinn, exactly how many moments do you have for questions, or should we try to?
I have time for maybe one more question.
Okay, cool. I'll try to pick a good one. Cool. In the meantime, thank you so much. And I'll just say goodbye to anyone who's logging off now. We really appreciate it. And let me try to pick a really. If
anybody has any questions that do not get answered today, please feel free to email me with any follow-up questions.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Sorry, that was a very important one. Yeah. So Quinn's email, and correct me if I'm wrong, is quinnh@balancedtx.com.
Yep.
She is an amazing person to talk to. I can vouch for that. And she'd love to hear from you, especially with some more of these clinical questions that we've had. A lot of people are asking about kind of advising clients and that sort of thing. Great thing to talk to Quinn about. So I guess one more question might be, why is this not talked about more? Why are these not in more trainings for future dietitians and therapists? Why is this so slow to take on? Obviously, you know, studies, etc. But what else is on your mind there?
Yeah, I have a million-dollar question. Honestly, it frustrates me to no end that this is not something that we get taught very much. I think that I had maybe a 3-minute conversation in one of my earliest nutrition classes about the concept of set point theory, and Haze hardly ever came up in my education, which is super frustrating. I think first off that there's a lot of honestly very antiquated things that are taught in a lot of educational programs. And I would like to see that change, and I would like to see that sort of move away from that paradigm. I know I got my master's degree at NYU, and while I didn't get a lot of information about this until I took a class on eating disorders, there are now student organizations, which is great, at NYU, where they are moving more towards doing, it's called the Anti-Dietetic Student Association, I think, and they're doing more work of like trying to get this information into schools. I think it is just hold over from using things and information that are no longer relevant or useful. I think that we need to start changing this. I honestly think of this as like a pretty important social justice issue that we have in our time. So I would love for all of you, anybody who is currently doing any kind of work in this field, if you can, trying to get this put into programs, because I think it is so useful, even for dietitians or any other clinicians who are not in the eating disorder field, to know this, so that somebody doesn't accidentally do more damage than good in their field. So, we have to all kind of ask HAES clinicians, ask anti-diet clinicians, push this message and try to get it out there as much as possible.
Thanks, Quinn. And I'll ask anyone who's on the client end to represent that same behavior to your community if you can, amongst friends. Question why we're talking about BMI, question why we're talking about specific weight. If you do have the courage to inform your doctor, show them the link, do that. Whatever you have time for, this is moving along, and it's going to take a lot of people and a lot of time to get this into the public consciousness. As a different way to think about weight. I just really want to thank Quinn for your time. I really appreciate you being here. We really appreciate all of you being here, and we really hope to hear from all of you in the future. Anyone who signed up, again, you'll get a follow-up link on Monday, and then possibly expect some folks from our admissions team reaching out to you with a quick email or a note just to follow up. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a beautiful weekend.
Yes, thank you all so much for attending.